Well, speaking of peanut butter and ice cream, Mick Foley likes his ice cream, and Mick Foley was one of the wrestlers featured this week on A&E's WWE Rivals, The Undertaker versus Mankind.
And I was looking forward to this, and it didn't let me down because they didn't get to work for years and years like Bobo and the Sheik, right? But what they did was so tremendous and so well remembered. And we've covered the Hell in a Cell match ad infinitum, and we've talked about Mick taking those bumps was a blessing and a curse. It made him memorable, but at the same time, it gave other people the idea that if they did it, they'd be Mick Foley, which couldn't be further from the truth because everybody overlooks his intelligence and psychology and verbal ability and physical ability and every other thing he has besides I fall down a lot off high things. But again, I loved watching this rivalry because of the footage and because the comments from people who were involved. The host and the panel are extraneous and not connected in any way to the subject. And they're being forced in, to this thing like a square peg in a round hole. And, they get right into it since this is not a biography. We didn't get to see, Mick's Long Island roots again or whatever the fuck. But they got right into the deal with pitching Mick Foley to Vince was challenging. And Jim Ross led the charge. And Bruce was all in favor of Mick. And of course I was. And Vince was never sold or convinced even when he signed him. And remember, I think he told JR one time, you're going to see what happens when a talent breaks your heart, pal. Because he just looked at Mick and he looked like shit because he had never seen Cactus Jack. And he didn't know what the fuck was going on there. And we knew it wasn't just about bumps, but that's what got the attention, but that he could talk and he was a person with a lot going on. So I would love to say that the dungeon videos with George did it, but actually, as we've told people, the sit down with JR is what really turned Vince McMahon on to Cactus. But the whole Mankind, the Mutilator thing, that, Mick jumped in and was able to change around to where it could be palatable enough for him to do, because that's the thing we've said so many times. When Vince hits you with an idea, if you're not quick enough and smart enough to make that idea not only better for him, but what you're willing to do, then you're fucked. But he did become Mankind, and they had the dungeon set built at the studio in Stamford. Because Mankind is going to be in the cellar, like the fucking serial killer movies and there's so many influences that everybody recognizes from what Vince was thinking about this thing. And I said, well, if we're going to put you in a fucking dungeon with the dark and the gloom, you need a rat, don't you? So I brought George to the studio. And George, I'll have you know, was a real trooper. Did not ask for a bonus that day or even any extra feed or water or anything. He did the shoot, and Mick loved it. George was an affectionate little thing. And he would never bite you. He'd only nibble on your little fingertips. But he liked to chew on sheets. When we'd take him on the road, sometimes he would chew holes in the sheets at the hotel. But nevertheless, so George Cornette, my pet rat, was in the cellar with Mankind. And, that's where you see Mick start taking this shit that could be really corny, no pun intended, really cheesy, no pun intended with George, or just bad, but he was so smart and so articulate and came up with a way to make it. You almost bought that this guy, if he doesn't live in a fucking dungeon cellar somewhere, he needs to be. And that's what not only started getting people interested in Cactus and Mankind and the WWF, but started getting Vince interested in him too, because he started seeing him taking this shit and making something out of it rather than just doing exactly what he was told. And that does get over with Vince. He likes you to do as you're told, but he likes you to take the shit that you are told to do and make it better while still doing the shit he likes, if that makes any sense. And Bruce and I were doing the TV formats at the time. So when they show the footage, like, the angle where he attacked Undertaker and dropped the elbow off the apron and everything, Vince didn't know what Cactus could do or not do, or the move or anything about. So Bruce and I did. And when we'd format shit or make a suggestion to Vince or whatever, we just suggest that Mick do shit that he already did. And Vince said, "You think he can do it?" "Oh, we're pretty sure he can do it." Okay. And, and then that's when obviously Shitstain was not a factor on the creative team in 1996 at this point in time, or elsewise, by the time they got to the Boiler Room Brawl, he would have had fucking naked strippers in the goddamn broom closets coming out with mops or whatever. But the Boiler Room Brawl was Vince's genesis of it, where he said this guy lives in the bowels of the building. He used to make a joke, and are we going back to the bowels? Because whenever he wanted to put Mankind somewhere, he'd say, "They're in the bowels of the building." But so he said if he lives in dungeons and cellars and bowels, he'll be in the boiler room. We'll have the fight in the boiler room. All right, so we ran with it. It's Vince's idea, but it was Undertaker and Mick setting it up and executing it, not like the hokey fucking, like the game show set bullshit that they come up with today, where everything's obviously set up as fake. It's not a real concession stand, or it's not a real catering room, or it's whatever. Taker and Mick went through the goddamn building and figured out what they could do based on what was really there, which is the whole point of wrestling. And the reason why tables and chairs were used in wrestling from this, because they were there. And I remember that. And by the way, that night at SummerSlam in Cleveland, August of 96 at the Gund Arena, not only was that the first ever Boiler Room Brawl, but it's the first time that I ever went to a Buffalo Wild Wings. Had never seen one before, I'll have you know, till after we got out of there.
Are you a fan?
I loved it. The last few times I've had it over the last couple of years, and of course I've been going to a lot of restaurants, their portions had gotten smaller and their fucking service not as good. But back then they were fucking wonderful. So anyway, and they did, again, this was one of the first times that Vince started out, say, well, I guess the precursor of a cinematic match, say, well, we'll pre-tape the fight in case it doesn't go well or whatever, and then they'll fight live into the arena. And they matched it up, and it was tough for Taker because he had to be bleeding from all the same places. But if you notice in that one, once they got out in the arena, that was the big moment. Cactus took the Nestea plunge bump off the apron there, like he did in the match with Mascaras in 90 at the Clash, but this time was on a much bigger stage. He was already in the main event, but it was still a big match. And that was and Bruce, you know how Bruce loved the Undertaker and loved the whole gimmick and Paul Bearer and the whole 9 yards. Well, that was Bruce shepherded that turn of Paul Bearer on the Undertaker when he withheld the urn and then whacked him with it and blah, blah, blah. So then, again, that set up the Buried Alive match in Indianapolis in October. And I don't know whose idea that was, what the genesis of it was. I've never heard Taker or Mick claim that they had the idea from scratch. I first heard Bruce and Vince talking about it when I went to the house for writing day. I didn't know, I wouldn't have booked it because I didn't know how you could do that or that we were allowed to spend that much money. I'd just been on the booking committee for 9 months. I didn't know we were allowed to fucking spend that much money on wild hairs of ideas. But the funny part was when we were talking about it, and the deal was Vince says, no, it's going to be, you got to leave the ring and go to the separate graveyard area in the arena. And then the open grave will be there, and you throw the guy in and cover him up. And I'd asked at Vince's living room table, I said, wait a minute. I said, how long is it going to take to cover him up? And Bruce at that point was, no. He just has to cover him a little bit, not fill the whole hole up. So we'll just till the dirt's over the top of him, and then that's good. Well, goddamn, that would have taken one motherfucker 15 minutes. Not one of us has ever been a professional gravedigger, right? So we had no frame of reference. And that was and I'd even said, should we try to run through this? Oh, it'd be okay. That was the night also, I've told this story, that the big severe thunderstorms came through the Northeast and delayed one of the World Series games. And it was a bin. And I had gotten out of the Northeast in my car driving, because I wasn't going to fly through that weather. It was being forecast. But Vince and JR, Bruce, everybody else tried to fly. And they didn't get into Indianapolis until 5 o'clock the next morning. I was asleep in the hotel by the time they showed up. But maybe that's why they run through so many things now, because it never occurred to everyone involved until he was trying to do it, that as big as that hole was, it was going to take him forever by himself to even get dirt over Undertaker. And that's what Vince is at the gorilla position. So every heel they could find that was still dressed, go out and help him cover up the Undertaker. And then we had come up with the finish at Vince's house, because that's the spot in every horror movie, right? So it's not, once we're going in that direction, it's not hard to figure out. As soon as Undertaker loses, he's buried alive. The bell rings, the gongs or whatever, the lightning bolt, because that was the pyro guy out of a horror movie. And can the hand come up out of the grave? So we called the guy that at the time was doing the special effects, and I don't know what his background was or whether he'd been in real television. He was a very secretive guy. He even had a gimmick telephone number that he only gave out to certain people, and the machine, as I recall, had no outgoing message. Just if you heard a beep, you knew. If you knew to leave a message. The guy's name was Richie Posner. And they called him and said, can this be done? Oh, yeah. So there was some kind of chamber underneath that once they supposedly somehow they got the dirt over him or whatever, that then they could open up a side door that he could roll into. And that's how underneath the tombstone, there was a pocket that he could be in. So when all the dirt was over it and the lightning bolt hit, that he could reach his hand up from the empty area that he was in and it would go through the thing. And it was okay. And that's, in those days, this was the first start of using special effects and gimmicks. So in a lot of cases, we didn't know whether it was going to work until it actually happened. And at some points, we didn't know. I sound like Dutch Mantel when they first made him the booker in Florida. He had a real hot run going, but they said, well, no, this wasn't the record house in this town but we had raised prices. And he said, well, hell, nobody told me I was allowed to raise the prices. Nobody told us for a while we were allowed to spend this much fucking money. And then by the time that we knew that, then Shitstain had come along, and then all of a sudden they're ordering Partridge Family buses for fucking no reason. But nevertheless, I will stop here to ask you, Brian, if you think that the people remember that it was almost 2 years between their 96 program and they got back together in 98 for Hell in a Cell.
I hadn't thought of it in that way, but I guess I hadn't thought that it was 2 years, no.
Because that's the thing. They worked this program for several months in 96 and then were apart and got back together as opponents in 98 for the Hell in a Cell and that little run. And this rivalry has lived on and lasted all those years when Mick was pretty much done as a full-time wrestler and out of the WWE as an active competitor by 2001, 2? And they had not been actively working this. So this was really two little short runs that were just so incredible. Because it was Yokozuna was probably the first time that Taker had an opponent in the WWF where in the ring he could do the shit he could do. Because, Vince, as we've talked about with the first few years, Giant Gonzalez and the big monsters and the heavy guys, and it wasn't until Yokozuna that Taker could really do the big shit that he could do. And then you couldn't do it with Yoko very long because he couldn't keep that pace up at that size. But with Cactus, he wasn't as big but he was crazy. And his shit was definitely believable as being damaging to himself or others. And the promos, it was the first time, I think, really, that the Undertaker's opponent could talk for himself rather than having the manager, right? So this was an in-ring revelation for people with what Undertaker was. They knew how good Cactus Jack was. Only Vince and Kevin Dunn didn't know that. But nobody knew how good the Undertaker was until he was able to work with a guy like this.
When do you think Vince started taking the Mick Foley?
With they've talked about the sit-down promo with JR was part of it. And then just being around Mick and seeing not only his work ethic, but that he made everything better. And that what an intelligent guy. And then you find out there's never a fucking problem. He's going to be early, not late. He's not on any substances. I mean, it was when you think about it, of all the years that Vince had already been running that company and been burned by people over a variety of things, if he made a list of everything I don't want a motherfucker that works for me to ever do again, Mick Foley was probably the only person that fit that fucking list and didn't even try. So anyway, and the Hell in a Cell meant something at that point. They'd had one of them, Taker and Michaels, debut of Kane. It had been protected.
Debut of Cell.
The debut of the Hell in a Cell itself. And then 9 months later, we're going to have another one. Remember what happened last time Undertaker was in a cell, blah, blah, blah. But it was not only a forbidding structure, but a thing that would instantly draw money with main event guys in it because it hadn't been done and overdone, and there was still blood and there was still violence. So, and Mick, again, had the idea, he could take that bump, and he talked Vince into it. Again, I believe, because I don't think Vince understood what the fuck that he was listening to. Much like the curtain call. I think that he didn't fully have a grip on exactly what Mick was saying. I think he thought he'd hang on to the side and kind of fall off, or I don't know what the fuck. But anyway, the match highlights. What a performance. It still looked like a fight. There was not obvious cooperation on the stunts. It was before they started cleaning off the table and gimmicking it so it'd fall apart when you look sideways at it. And we've talked about, but it bears mentioning again, the dramatic return of Mick Foley to the match, to the ring, after being thrown off the top of the cell was planned. That was fine. That's exactly what was supposed to happen. And him climbing back up to the top and the crowd being insane and everything was, once he lived through that bump off the top of the cell, everything was going according to plan. And then the choke slam. Not only does the whole thing just instantly fly open under his fucking back, but the chair follows him on the way down and bashes his face in. That's where okay, he ain't getting up. And Terry Funk was not supposed to go back out there at that point. And honestly, I don't even remember that all the rest of the people, agents and everybody, were supposed to go back out at that point. I think they were going out to see literally on the fly there if Mick was going to be able to get back up. And Terry's interaction with Undertaker there at that point was all ad-libbed to buy Cactus time to get his wits back about him. So that was all, it was just unfolding as it happened. None of that was called ahead of time. And our big concern, me and Bruce and Vince at the start, because I don't know if Bruce knew about it, sitting a gorilla, I was never informed of it. But the biggest concern that anybody in the office had going into the Hell in a Cell match was Taker's, was it his foot or his ankle? What had he cracked? It wasn't like an ankle broken in two. He could walk on it. It was healing. It was a fractured bone. He had it taped up heavily.
Was it like Hawk? Was it like Hawk on the scaffold?
Something like that. And the thing that he was wondering about, and they didn't show this clip, but you can see it twice. He had a problem when he had to climb back down from that cage, getting down from the cage to the floor, and when he had to come through the top, it had given way and get into the cage with Cactus. When he dropped down that time and landed on his feet, if you watch the unedited match, you'll see him pull up instantly and start limping, Taker, from just dropping into the ring. So we thought, okay, that had been our worry beforehand. Taker's injured. Can they get through with this match? And halfway in, we're worried, will Mick Foley fucking live through this? So, and then Taker says, go home. And Mick's got to do the thumbtack spot. And I loved Undertaker's response to it. We don't need the tacks, because they didn't need the tacks. But Cactus wanted to do the tacks. And this was his worst contribution to wrestling. He made the fucking stupid thumbtacks acceptable, where now we can't get rid of them. And as you recall, when he was in the back, this is the spot that he did not remember doing afterwards, because when we got him set down in some air and tried to give him oxygen to, get his breath, he said, Corny, did I do the thumbtack spot? I said, they're sticking in your fucking arms. But anyway, and that was true. He said, I can't be on two stretchers in one night, because they were going to wheel him out. And he got up and limped out, etc. But from the end of the program, we have come to learn that he has come to terms with the Hell in a Cell match being his Citizen Kane. And that's fine, because we always told him, you can't top the bump off the cage, so don't try. It will be replayed and remembered forever. You're not going to top it. And, as we said, he knew at that point that his body was going to break down, before that it actually did. But that was 1998, where in the summertime. Was Mick a full-time wrestler another 4 years? Was it? He started part-time, and then he was done except for special appearances. So it's not like he had a ton of time and a ton of variety of opponents to try to top this thing anyway.
Well, that was A&E's Rivals.
No fucking counterpoint on your part? You didn't see anything wrong with this? Don't want to pick at anybody?
I mean, there's very little to say at this point, just because we've seen so much coverage of this feud and that match over the years. I feel like there's very little in the nitpick.
Did you spot my appearance?
At the very end of the Mankind video, when the dungeon video? Was that your voice or no?
Okay, you got it. Yeah, okay. Because they showed one of the takes with George in the dungeon, and then he does his take, and then they have the 3 or 4 seconds of silence, and then you say, what do I say after every time I hear somebody do a good promo? Excellent! Excellent!
I'll say something that you won't agree with.
What?
I'm actually not crazy about those dungeon promos, just because it kind of goes against what I like in wrestling, which is some sort of realism. Why is he there and there's a cameraman there?
Exactly.
Yeah, so I've never been a fan of those promos. And they came right after what were the best promos of the previous year, which were Cactus Jack and ECW.
Oh, of course. But since Vince had never seen any of that shit, he wanted to put him in the dungeon. So now what am I going to do being paid by a billionaire, old billionaire Vince?
He wasn't a billionaire.
He wasn't a billionaire then, but he had more money than I did. So what was I going to do being paid by millionaire Vince when one of my not only good friends, but one of my favorite wrestlers, finally gets a chance to come into company, and they're going to stick him in a fucking fake dungeon and have him cut a promo, am I going to sit by and watch him twist slowly in the wind? Or am I going to bring him a rat? And I brought him a rat. And I firmly believe that the presence of George Cornette that day, along with Mick Foley's outstanding verbal ability, turned those promos from a fucking guy in a weird outfit in a fake dungeon into something that made mankind a little spookier than the average bear. But no, I wouldn't have put him in a dungeon either. But since he was there, I brought George.
Well, that was a very spooky edition of WWE Rivals, produced by WWE for A&E.
For us, by us.
Jim, well, that's FUBU. I wouldn't associate them with WWE, but...
Oh, that's right. WWE was associated with FUBAR.